Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I am thinking right now about Reverend Dr. Amy Butler, our Riverside Church senior minister. Pastor Amy, we lift up prayers of thanksgiving for your continued recovery and for your phenomenal children who are caring for you. I'm thinking about her last sermon, the one entitled Hysterical, when she imagined out loud how her obituary would read. In 2017, she entered the Riverside pulpit and commenced a feminist rant that made everyone uncomfortable. It reminds me of a dinner party I attended recently. We were all gathered around the table when someone asked, "What do you teach at Union Theological Seminary?" I could have said, "I teach womanist theology, African American women's religious experience," and instead I answered without thinking, and before I realized that I was about to name every topic my mother taught me to never raise at the dinner table. To honor my mother, who is visiting Riverside Church this morning, I will tell you that I hesitated before I answered. I teach race, gender, sex, religion, and politics. My mother is writing my obituary right now. You could say that every pulpit in America this morning is preaching a sermon on religion and politics. Whether or not you are explicitly naming a political position, religion in America is always political. The notion of American exceptionalism upon which this country was founded is itself a religious ideal. Womanist scholar Kelly Brown Douglas speaks of America buying into the Anglo-Saxon myth of exceptionalism, of racial superiority, where whiteness is cherished property. She does not need yesterday's KKK rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, to demonstrate what it means when people think that whiteness is the mark that deems a person fit for citizenship, that whiteness has long defined what it means to be created in the image of God. Anything that cannot pass the test of whiteness cannot get to God, so the story goes, and as she puts it, America is God's master plan, she tells us. America has a divine purpose. America's greatness comes from its sense of being chosen by God, and its exceptionalism is given sacred legitimation. America's story is God's story, or as my professor Martin Marty once put it, America made a liturgy out of their history. Like most prophets, the prophet Zechariah is completely entangled in religion and politics. One of the things that makes a prophet prophetic is the God talk that defies the politics of respectability, the boldness of faith that may lead you to say things that are not so polite at the dinner table or from the pulpit. A prophet breaks the rules and says the things you're not supposed to say. Now, this is different from what Naomi Klein calls shock politics, or what Bonnie Honig calls emergency politics. Emergency politics is when the fear of political crisis gets manipulated and used to justify outrageous lawmaking decisions like surveillance and torture and walls. The political trick is to exploit our fears, our sense of vulnerability, and then to demonize the religious other, criminalize the resident alien, make a trope out of the urban predator. And once we buy into the narrative, we begin to think that justice means the criminal justice system, that safety means militarism. The ultimate rule of law is guided by protection against perceived threats. And what exactly is being threatened? My exceptionalism, my right to possession. The interesting thing about shock politics is that it exists right alongside the numbing normalization of violence. Violence in our culture has become so ordinary that we sometimes don't even recognize it as violence. The indifference to injustice that has become so commonplace becomes part of our everyday lived experience. In other words, there's a learned ignorance. Racism and sexism are quotidian. They're largely uninterrogated. Cultural practices are the result of hidden socializations that become so commonplace and routine, they're barely recognizable. They're so insidiously embedded in the cultural milieu and in everyday thoughts and practices. Some have argued that there is nothing at all shocking about the election of a Donald Trump. All that he stands for lies in the very DNA of U.S. history. We can, without difficulty whatsoever, connect the dots from the election of a black president to the persistent murder of unarmed black men and boys and girls and women, to the election of one who stands as a symbol of white supremacy. There's nothing shocking here at all. As Naomi Klein explains it, when placed in a context where celebrity status and fakeness, wealth and power are fetishized, the current predicament is predictable and cliche. I do not need to tell the Riverside Church, my church family, that in this messy entanglement of religion and politics, we need a political faith. We know that the church is called to respond. The commitment to radical social change is a witness to the Prince of Peace. We know that the exiles, not the imperial powers, will be witnesses to God's power. But I call on the prophet Zechariah to remind us of two things we sometimes forget. That we're called to be a people of hope, not fear and despair, and that the work we do to bring in God's realm is not entirely up to us. For Zechariah, the question of violence and militarism is front and center. The text we read this morning is known as the Hymn of the Warrior King. And when we read it closely, we discover in it a politics of hope. The exiled people of ancient Israel are preoccupied by the question of leadership. Many blamed the exile on corrupt leadership, the abuse of royal power. As the exile dragged on, disillusionment and the kingship grew. So Zechariah proclaims, "Lo, your king comes to you." We are called to live in a stance of expectant hope. But in the face of diminished hope, we must not be seduced by false hope. The imperial seduction is the lure into thinking that the control belongs to the Babylonian Empire and to the imperial ruler who sets the terms and conditions for economic and political power. But the divinely appointed ruler will demilitarize the city, the state, and the nation. Zechariah tells us that this ruler will cut off the chariot and the war horse, and the battle bow shall be broken. This ruler is not a warrior. This ruler is the Prince of Peace. Evidence of the ruler's peacefulness will be the animal he rides on, a donkey. A donkey is not a war animal. The donkey is a sign of peace. There are no chariots or war horses here. The war horse is false hope. The king riding on a donkey is a king who has confidence in Yahweh. The establishment of the new kingdom of Israel would be the work of God, not the work of a military might. Yahweh is the divine warrior king. God will do the necessary fighting. The sword is in God's hand. God's commitment to peace is shown through disarmament. So unlike our notion of justice being tied up with punishment and vengeance, justice in the Old Testament is notoriously focused on the needs of the disadvantaged, the widow, the orphan, the resident alien, the poor. The donkey is a sign of peace and humility. The donkey is also a sign of hope. That the king enters the city on a donkey is a proclamation about future enthronement. The king on the donkey is a metaphorical description of the coronation and enthronement of God in the future promise. This is not a social program or a political affair of nation states. And notice that the call is not an encouragement to believe in political progress. There are too many counterfactuals to believe that this is part of the promise. The summons comes not from our favorite progressive or most inspiring activist. The call comes from God. This is a divine summons with a divine purpose to which we have been invited to participate, but which we cannot actually accomplish. This is a bizarre arrangement, an absurd state of affairs, that we are called to hope in something we cannot, by human capacity, achieve ourselves. And yet the fact that we are not in the end capable of toppling the imperial powers, the awareness of our powerlessness is precisely the point. It is when the prophet announces the promise. I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit because of the blood of my covenant. Hope is sustained by the promise of a sustained relationship, and more, the relationship is sustained on God's side. For we will fail to uphold the covenant. We will despair. We will lose hope. Here there is no uncertainty, no hesitation from the prophet. The point rests in the difficulty of the task, the unsustainability of the spiritual discipline to hope. There is no benefit in the shame of our broken promise to ourselves, to others, or to God. The unsustainability points to the fact that the realization of the promise rests with God. The promise is fulfilled not as a result of our obedience, not even our activism, not even our fervor. The promise is fulfilled by God. That the discipline to hope can be sustained only temporarily points directly to the eternal promise, a blood promise. Why does the matter of religion and politics belong to the church? When it seems we will only remain prisoners of fear, confined by pits of despair, how do we sustain hope? When did we learn that God is a God of hope? The politics of hope is a political economy of a different sort. The covenant is not conditioned on our success in the resistance movement. It is not the prize for our labors. Instead, the abundant and overflowing excess of the promise conditions the resistance. God's grace makes our labor possible. The resistance to empire is the invitation to participate in the promise already fulfilled. In this we may find God's glory. For the promise the prophet announces is that God has glorified us, we who are forgetful and complacent and despairing. Still, it seems misguided, simple-minded to live in hope. In the face of North Korea's missile program and the U.S. military plan called Kill Chain, hope seems extraordinarily naive. From the place of fear and despair, the ministries of Riverside Church look entirely irrational. Our culture of cynicism would permit no freedom school. Hope belongs to the promise of peace, but make no mistake, hope is not quietism. It is not passive, it is certainly not silent resignation. The hope Zechariah has in mind is hope of a belligerent sort, loudmouthed, looking for a fight, a holy war theology. Hope is the rejection of this culture of fear that is used to justify totalitarian regime. Hope is a political act because it is a rejection of the status quo that only God can imagine. Hope is knowledge that the sword is in God's hands. Zechariah proclaims, "Return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope." This is a curious phrase, an oxymoron. Our refuge, our protection comes from hope. Because of the fierceness of God's commitment to us through the blood covenant, we are surrounded by the border walls of hope, where fear cannot creep in and steal divine promise. We are bound by God's promises. The hope of which the prophet speaks is not a psychological disposition. Hope is not rhetorical flourish. Hope is not simply optimism or the capacity to resist resignation and despair. Hope is not an attribute of the American spirit. We do not place our hope in the human capacity for self-transcendence. We place our hope in God. God is the one fighting for the kingdom. The Prince of Peace brings about the reign of God. Because without God, our hope will inevitably lead to despair. There is no guarantee of our success. We are prisoners of hope when we finally grasp, with all the fullness of grace, that the fight is not up to us entirely. We are prisoners of hope because hope is a place of refuge, a place where we may rest from the weariness that sets in from our activism, where we may rest our throats that are hoarse from shouts of outrage and lament, where we may find support for our backs bent over from the weight of despair. We heard it this morning in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus calls to us and says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The peace proclaimed is not merely the absence of war, but the establishment of God's realm with all its covenant blessings. Hope is the holdout that Israel will experience blessings again. Return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope. Today I declare that I will restore to you double. Zechariah speaks a holy city full of girls and boys playing in the streets. Zechariah speaks to a holy city where old women and old men shall again sit in the streets. The most vulnerable are free to play. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. What reason do we have to rejoice? Because lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey. The battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. As prisoners of hope, may we wait in the fullness of faith for a new realm, the reign of God, for the one on the donkey is set to be exalted. He is the one on the way to being enthroned. Amen and amen.